You're listening to Season 9 of Bionic Planet, the longest-running program in any medium devoted to bridging the gaps between legitimate debate and public discourse in climate and biodiversity finance. This is episode 102.
Some scientists, their goals are to convince other people that they know what they're doing, they've got things under control, and they can predict the future with high levels of certainty. And I think that attitude does a tremendous damage to the profession.
Dr. Stardust, winner of the International Jugglers Association People's Choice Award, combines his extensive scientific knowledge with award-winning juggling to create a new form of theatrical entertainment. Dr. Stardust is Gil Pontius, PhD, environmental scientist, and professional entertainer.
Dr. Robert Gilmore Pontius Jr. is also today's guest. He developed some of the most important tools for estimating deforestation risk way back in the early 1990s. And today we'll learn about the people he learned from, the people he's teaching, and how he's working with other leading scientists from around the world to harvest the lessons of the past 30 years and create the carbon markets of tomorrow.
Man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the waste products of his civilization.
There's a group of us now who are proposing that the Earth has actually entered a new epoch, and that is the Anthropocene.
We know that the enemy is carbon, and we know its ugly face. We should put a big fat price on it, and of course, add to that, drop the subsidies.
I didn't plan to run today's show the way I'm running it. I reached out to Gil Pontius to fill in some gaps in my ongoing untold story of the voluntary carbon markets. But he and I ended up having a much longer, wide-ranging, and philosophical discussion than I expected. He's one of these guys who, once he gets a verbal head of steam, you just want to tag along for the ride. And in the end, I figured that our conversation served my goal of bridging the gap between the real debates underpinning the evolution of carbon finance and the silliness that's come to dominate public discourse. So I'll have a more structured, nitty-gritty episode next week, but for now, I hope you enjoy this journey into the philosophy of science and land change modeling. We discuss the need to embrace uncertainty, the folly of holding out for imagined states of perfection, the value of simplicity over complexity, and the difference between science and advocacy.
I am Robert Gilmore Pontius Jr. Friends call me Gil, but my literature is under Robert Pontius. I am a professor of geography at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts in the United States. And I specialize in geographic information science. That's the technology that creates and analyzes digital maps. And I use that technology to study land change, how humans change the land and how land changes humans. And my area of specialty is the computer simulation models of how humans modify the landscape, and in particular, deforestation, which people frequently deforest for very practical purposes because deforestation is hard. It takes a lot of effort. People don't do it for fun. They do it because they have objectives. And some of those objectives are agriculture or residential land. And my doctorate is in environmental science. And my master's degree is in applied statistics. So I take a very quantitative approach to this. My doctorate was at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, where I developed a computer simulation model called GeoMod. The goal of that was to simulate tropical deforestation and the carbon emissions that derive from the landscape, from that deforestation. And that was funded by the United States Department of Energy, who was quite appropriately concerned about climate change.
And you left out your alter ego, Dr. Stardust.
Oh, yes. In my other life, I am a professional performer, juggler, Dr. Stardust, who won the People's Choice Award at the International Jugglers Association Championships.
Yeah. I don't remember seeing that on your CV, but it's quite an impressive accomplishment.
It's on there.
It is there?
Even when I interviewed for my job at Clark University, I put that on, and that's helped remarkably in a variety of ways.
I'm sure. Reading your CV is like reading a novel. It just goes, the things you've done over the course of your 30 plus years in this space. Why don't we start about how you got into it?
I've always loved mathematics. And I was a math major in my bachelor's degree. And then in my master's degree in applied statistics, it was so satisfying to be able to apply mathematics to really practical issues. And then it was in graduate school, I realized I fell in love with maps. And there's actually a large number of us who have a fascination with maps. And I wanted to do something really meaningful with my quantitative skills. I applied to a doctoral program, not really certain what I was getting myself into, but I just knew I wanted to do something really meaningful with my scientific skills. And so I entered the program, and I got tremendously inspired by two particular professors. One was a brand new professor, and one was a very senior professor. The relatively new professor, John Toll, was teaching a course on quantitative modeling and public policy. And he had us do a reading from a book called Uncertainty by Morgan and Henrian. It had on there a table of motivations of why scientists do policy-relevant work. And the order of the sequence was interesting. At the top, it was things like to get an answer to a question, or to make development on a general topic. And then as you go down the list, there were other things like to convince other people what you're doing. And then at the bottom of the list, there were things like because you enjoy it, or because you want to get promoted in your job, or because it's the only thing you know how to do. And that made quite an impression upon me. And I look back on my own work, and I've actually had several of those motivations. I do this because I enjoy it. And I feel completely comfortable with saying that, because if you don't enjoy it, you're not going to dedicate time to it, and you're not going to do a good job. And I do things to get promoted. Why? Because I want to keep my job, because I like what I'm doing. And also, but I do have a motivation that I do want the research to do some good for somebody. And that even makes things tremendously satisfying. The other professor who was such a great inspiration, I took his course just because it sounded interesting. The course was called The Ecology of the Economic Process by Professor Charlie Hall, who became my supervisor of my dissertation. And he's such an impressive, inspirational professor. He's very fascinated with how energy is used in economies. And he is a systems ecologist. And he's the one who was a co-investigator on this grant from the Department of Energy. When I got involved, the only thing I knew is that he had money for me to be a research assistant. So that sounded good. And he had maps, and I liked maps. And he needed someone to write a computer program to simulate tropical deforestation. So I thought sounded like it was a good fit. And I didn't know at the time, the other co-investigators on this grant were the world's most eminent carbon scientists for terrestrial carbon. That's for forest, especially tropical forest. We had Sandra Brown, Richard Ski Houghton of Woods Hole Research Center, Dave Skoll, Inez Fung. These were the best minds concerning tropical deforestation and the greenhouse gas emissions that come from it.
I've only accessed one of these minds directly, and that was Sandra Brown's. Sandra was a towering figure in the field of land change modeling, and her work features prominently in the next installment in this Tribes of the Climate Realm series. I'll have it up early next week, and if you worked with Sandra Brown or have other memories to share from the pioneering days of climate finance, reach out to me at steve@bionic-planet.com. That's steve@bionic-planet.com. Also, if you like the show and you want more and better episodes, then help me deliver them by becoming a patron at patreon.com/bionicplanet. That's patreon.com/bionicplanet. Your support, starting at just $1 per episode with a monthly cap, helps me deliver top-notch content. Now back to Gil Pontius.
I had one goal as a doctoral student. I wanted to graduate as soon as possible. I looked at what they had proposed in the grant that we got, and I looked at that and I said, if we try to do that, I'm never going to graduate. But I enjoyed computer programming, and in that time, my advisor and I, we used the language Fortran that I learned in high school, and he learned in college, and we had a particular goal to make a model, a simulation model to simulate deforestation. And we had the luxury where we had maps from 3 time points in Costa Rica of forest versus non-forest. But I had to do all of Africa, for which we had maps at 1 time point. But we had a map of where forest and non-forest were, and we had a variety of other variables. So I was in the situation of, given the available data and technology, how do I do something that's going to allow me to graduate? And so I used actually a lot of the theoretical courses that I took in statistics to do what seemed the logical thing to do with the data that I had available. Charlie Hall had such great advice. He said, when you start a project, first get your data and look at it. And then do the next obvious thing and see what trouble that gets you into, and then figure out what to do next, which is exactly what I did. So I produced the model GeoMod to use the available data, which was very scarce at the time, but to use it in a straightforward, understandable way. And I got a job at Clark University, and boy, Clark is phenomenal. I had the great fortune to work with Professor Ron Eastman, who created the TerraSet software. At that time, it was known as Adresi. And Ron was so welcoming, and Ron was very interested in land change modeling. And he had my code incorporated into the GIS software that has 100,000 users worldwide. So that really launched my career. And with Ron's help and the GIS software, there were people all over the world using GeoMod and the other features in the software. I was trying to keep my job. I was hired as a visiting professor. And I was reading the literature. And people would naturally wonder, how accurate is this model? And so I thought up from first principles, the theoretical statistics I learned, this particular metric that would compare the pattern simulated to a random pattern. Because in statistics, that was a big theme, comparison to randomness. Mm-hmm. And so I derived this metric, and I thought I was pretty clever for that. But in one of my jobs at Boston University, they said, yeah, Pontius, people have known about that. That's a popular metric known as kappa. But then I saw problems with this metric kappa. And so I published a
What
paper.
does kappa? That's an acronym, right?
No, that's the Greek letter.
Okay. All right.
It's a metric of agreement. Can range between -1 and +1, where +1 means perfect agreement and 0 means agreement equivalent due to random chance. And so I saw some problems with kappa, and so I published these more elaborate versions of kappa. And that got incorporated into the software. And then I started going to conferences and seeing how people misinterpreted kappa. And I thought, oh my God, I've just walked people right into the fire. And so 10 years later, I published a paper entitled Death to Kappa. And I made a public apology for the previous work that I had done. And I said some of the ideas in that previous work were good and some were, quite frankly, useless. And please don't use kappa anymore, but use these other helpful metrics. And one of the motivations for me to write that is to give a demonstration to the scientific community that we're humans, we're all making mistakes all the time because we try to do something, given the information that we had at the time. But what good scientists do, they learn from their mistakes and they admit them and they say what their motivation was at the time, and then they clarify it and present something better, which is exactly what I did with that paper, Death to Kappa, which has now become my most highly cited paper. And so I wanted to give an example to the research community because I see variation even among professors in their motivations. I see some scientists, their goals are to convince other people that they know what they're doing, they've got things under control, and they can predict the future with high levels of certainty. And I think that attitude does a tremendous damage to the profession. And these are scientists with doctorates. But my most satisfying experience recently is the last couple of years working with Professor Eastman and Dr. Becky Dixon at TerraCarbon. And we've been working with Vera, which is an organization involved in carbon offset projects. We've been working with them to design a model to simulate tropical deforestation for the sake of carbon offset projects. And we've been having weekly meetings for more than 2 years now. And it's the best part of my week because of the personality characteristics of the people involved. These are the type of scientists who very readily admit their mistakes. They say why, they investigate. They say why some of their past suspicions were wrong. They make corrections. And it's a type of agenda where we maximize learning. And we're not in the business of trying to say that we've solved all the problems. That's not what good scientists do. What good scientists do is search for the most important problems and try to rank those about what are the most challenging problems and focus research on that, and to say what we know and what we don't know and how we can make progress. And that's why I like working with that group so much. And I see the same characteristics in the scientists at Vera. They're in this to have a meaningful life. They see serious problems with climate change and tropical deforestation. And through simulation modeling and carbon offset projects, there's an opportunity to do something about it. And these projects, they're happening, and they're going to happen in even a bigger way because leaders in the tropics want them. Talk to the current president of Brazil. He's got a plan to stop deforestation and get those countries with the money who were the root of climate change by burning fossil fuels in the industrialized world, they're going to pay for it through carbon offset projects. But now the question is how to implement that and how to use the best available science to implement that while acknowledging the uncertainties. And that's exactly what we're working on in this collaboration with Clark Labs and Terra Carbon and Vera. And it's the most satisfying thing I've ever done. And these scientists are such that they are making an agenda to maximize learning. We're not trying to convince the world that we can predict the future with very detailed levels of accuracy. In fact, doing that is not even necessary to have effective carbon offset projects. There's a whole slew of things that are necessary for that. And we're making a contribution where we can and trying to advance the profession, getting hammered by our critics who are coming at us from a variety of perspectives. But I think some of them, they've already made up their mind of what their opinion is, are trying to use techniques to convince other people that their answers are correct, that the answers that they have already made up in their mind. And to me, that's just not science.
Yeah, and the trouble is that approach has a very clear narrative, and it tends to spread more quickly.
Yeah.
You talked about math, maps, and meaning, which is interesting to me because maps are so visual. Math is the opposite, and that leads to a lot of confusion on land change modeling, which I hope to demystify in this series. I'd like to get to that, but I'd like to stick a pin in this issue of science versus advocacy, or as I talk about pseudoscience versus science, certainty versus uncertainty. I think it was Bertrand Russell who said that uncertainty is disquieting, but certainty is ridiculous. I really want to get into this whole issue of science versus advocacy, or pseudoscience versus science, and uncertainty versus certainty, because I think proponents have hurt the cause by not getting into public discussions on this.
Yeah.
But before we go there, can you just give us like a thumbnail history of GIS, land change modeling, the rationale behind it, and how it works?
I guess we can begin with our data. Much of our data comes from sensors that are mounted on satellites. And those sensors will detect the electromagnetic reflectance from the Earth. And then there's a procedure to take that information and convert it into a digital map. And even there's an art to that. And that has a variety of challenges. If you're going to make a map of even forest versus non-forest, you need a definition of forest, which can be tricky.
Yeah.
Also, the sensor was designed by the engineers who had the engineering technology at the time. So in the early days, the units of analysis, the squares, the pixels, were 30 meters by 30 meters. And then we realized that there's challenges with that because a pixel can be partially forest and partially non-forest. And then some people said, now we need smaller pixels, finer resolution. And now I'm working with half-meter resolution. And we still see it's partially tree and partially not tree.
Yeah.
So there's a slew of challenges with that. But we have now a long time series of maps of land cover. And we can see that there's tremendous deforestation. That's clear. Then the question is what to do about it. And I think of what my mentor, Professor Eastman, said. He doesn't want to spend his career documenting the downfall of humanity. He wants to actually do something about it. And he and I have been developing these land change models for decades now. And realizing lots of pitfalls and lots of productive ways forward. And so there's now a suite of tools in what I think is the best GIS around, which is TerraSet. It has a suite of tools that all in one platform. You can do remote sensing, you can analyze land change, and you can simulate land change specifically with applications for carbon offset projects. And you can design scenarios of future land change. And with all of these outputs, you get mathematical measurements and you get maps and you get other types of graphics to visualize the data. You need all three types of information. You need to look at the maps. You need to see the information displayed in another way graphically, and you need to have numbers. And we get informed by all three types of information, that they complement each other remarkably well. And if you go about it intelligently, you can identify where the challenges are. And with my group of colleagues, we're exposing light on those challenges. I go to some other meetings and people are telling me that their data and models are good. And I sit in the front row and I said, can you please define what you mean by good? And frequently they give me a metric that I've studied for years, which I know is fundamentally flawed. And they give me a number inevitably between 0.8 and 0.95. Why? Because, well, that sounds high. And if they claim it's perfect, no one's going to believe them and they're going to be out of a job. But when I ask that question, I'm actually looking for the motivation. I'm not trying to tell them that their models and data are bad, because that would require me to have a definition of bad. Asking them just to define their own word, good, and I realized they frequently don't have one. That if the type of scientists, I see two types. One who digs in their heels and insists that they should be believed and their data are good. But then you get them in the hallway and some of them say, oh yeah, I know this is really challenging stuff. And then those people can be effective in going forward. So one of my goals is to lower the level of defensiveness that scientists feel, because they're being attacked by other people who say, oh, you have uncertainty. And some scientists say, oh, no, but my data are certain. That's a big mistake.
Yeah.
You should say, of course there's uncertainty. And that's where we're putting our research agenda. Everything in life has uncertainty. And so with this group I'm working with now, who's making this simulation model that will be used to influence how billions of dollars is going to exchange hands, what we have been doing is articulating the levels of certainty and uncertainty that we have. And we have actually spent 2 years thinking about how to define good. Good for what? And for the carbon offset projects, is it good enough to justify these flows of money? And it's a remarkably tricky thing to do. And we're not being naive about it. We're not just trying to get some number to convince other people that we should be trusted. We are designing it to facilitate a transparent conversation. And that's the way you do high quality science. And the scientists who don't do that, they get attacked justifiably. But if you look at our work, we're designing a model explicitly so other people can understand it.
Yeah.
And so we're ready for attacks from all directions, even the scientific community. Some people say, well, you should be using artificial intelligence and machine learning. Okay, but many other people say that's all smoke and mirrors and it's difficult to understand, which is a valid point. It's remarkably challenging to understand. Even some of the experts don't understand how artificial intelligence works. But we've designed the procedure such that if someone wants to use a machine learning algorithm, they can. But we have a definition of a benchmark model that is very easy to understand and compute with the available data. And if someone wants to use some fancier model, then they have to beat that benchmark. And let me tell you, we've done a lot of testing. It's challenging to beat our benchmark. Our benchmark model for predicting deforestation is that deforestation will tend to occur near the edge of the forest and non-forest. Just look at the data. And deforestation will tend to occur more in municipalities where it has historically occurred. And with those two variables that are available across the globe, we've created a model based on high school level mathematics that people can understand, that anyone can hire someone with a master's degree in GIS, and within a few weeks, that person can test other people's work. So we have many criteria of good. Some criteria relate to accuracy, predictive accuracy, but we have all sorts of other criteria that relate to transparency. And we have a feedback mechanism where users can have their questions answered. That's how science progresses, and that's the kind of modeling that we're doing with this collaboration with Clark Labs and TerraCarbon and Vera. And so if you're an aspiring student out there, it's a very fascinating field to get into. You'll learn phenomenal technical skills, but you need to go to the right place, because some scientists are saying, use this software and you'll be able to predict the future accurately. I see it in journal articles all the time. But come to Clark University, work with Clark Labs and Clark's Center for Geospatial Analytics. We have a wonderful faculty, and we're rapidly becoming, I think we already are, probably the best place in the world to get an education in land change modeling, especially related to carbon offset projects. We're connected directly to people who are implementing these. And it opens a variety of fascinating questions that bachelor's, master's, and doctoral students can do. And it's a phenomenal career. The issue of tropical deforestation and climate change is just going to get bigger, and the GIS field is getting bigger all the time. It's a great opportunity for students to get an education in this field, and come to Clark. I'll be happy to work with you.
Do you take old people like me? And do you have online stuff?
Absolutely. We're equal opportunity, but not for everyone. And I tell people, I'm not willing to take on a student unless that student is willing to tell me when they think I'm wrong. I don't want students to come here and agree with me all the time. That's not the way learning happens. So I want students who can think creatively, think for themselves, listen to my advice. I can direct students to very interesting questions. I'm not here to dish out the answers because I don't have the answers. That's not what scientists do. The most important thing scientists do is to create the interesting questions and then get wonderful students like we have at Clark and make progress on these questions.
You may be flooded with questions pretty soon.
Yeah.
Including from me.
Well, hopefully flooded with applications to our bachelor's, master's, and doctoral programs. That's what we're looking for.
And while you're poking around in those programs, if you decide you want to help others learn as well, then consider helping me deliver more and better episodes of Bionic Planet by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Bionic Planet. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Your support, starting at just $1 per episode with a monthly cap, helps us deliver top-notch content. In this series, I am going to be getting into the history of the current methodologies. While the new methodologies are a lot simpler and everything points to it capturing the bulk of current deforestation risk, there's a tendency to say, okay, the new stuff is coming out and it's great. The old stuff is bad. It's junk. Let's throw it all away. And I just don't see it that way. When I go to projects that are probably not going to make the cut for the next round, they're doing good work that won't be captured in the new models. And to me, they should continue somehow. And I'm wondering if we can take a look at the genesis of geomod so people see where that all came from.
Yes. Okay. That's an excellent question. I have very fascinating things to say about that. And I'm glad I gave the background of how I started in all of this. I had a map from one time point, but it was a landscape that I knew originally had all forest in tropical countries. Before the European colonization, much of these landscapes were completely forested. So if you have a map of one time point of forest versus non-forest, that means all the non-forest had been deforested. Okay? If that's the only map you had, then I would predict that the next places that become deforested are on that edge, forest and non-forest. That single variable, we've done tremendous testing of lots of variables. If you know that variable, that gets the majority of it. And now we have maps from more than one time point. Just look at maps from a few time points. You can see the progression of deforestation. It's frequently along the edge. Not all the time, but much of it.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can do a lot with 0 independent variables, right? And let's just say you have one other independent variable, but you want it to be a variable you can get anywhere in the world. Across the landscapes, among various countries, cut themselves up into smaller political units. And typically they're nested. In the United States, we have states and counties and towns. Let's take a unit called a municipality. So that's a categorical variable. First of all, you can compute the overall percent of deforestation across the entire region. And typically we're looking at about over 6 or 10 years, we're talking about 2% of a region becomes deforested. And so you'd want to know in which municipalities is the deforestation happening more intensively than 2%, and in which municipalities is the deforestation happening less intensively than 2%. Well, that's a straightforward calculation. Very straightforward. That's middle school. That computation is called a relative frequency. And so you just want to know, is the relative frequency of a municipality greater than 2% or less than 2%? If it's greater than 2%, those are municipalities that are experiencing the deforestation more intensively than across the entire landscape. And then when you simulate deforestation along the edge and more intensively in those municipalities that have experienced more deforestation. Bam. One independent variable, a map of forest, non-forest, and where the deforestation has occurred. And you can make a model on that, and that is our benchmark model. You can create it with data that's available any place. And we have been testing how difficult it is to make a predictive model to beat that benchmark. It's challenging. And there's other variables.
And you tested by looking at a prediction and then looking 3 years later, right? It's like you're looking at real world data.
That is exactly what we're doing. Rigorous scientific concept is the process of calibrating a model, and that's the process of setting the parameters that you'll use to simulate forward. And then you look at that time interval where you've simulated forward that was not the time interval that you used to set the parameters, and see how accurately it predicts. So we have a various rigorous separation of calibration and validation through time. And that's how we do the model assessment. And so we have that benchmark model. And if you want to use some other model, you have to prove that you can beat the benchmark. And you can also, users can use any other variables. I think some usual suspects out there: slope, the steepness, and elevation. I predict there's going to be no deforestation on the tops of the mountains. Yeah, you'll be right about that, but so will the benchmark.
Let me just interject here with a couple of questions for you. First, how are you enjoying the show? And second, what kind of people do you think are still listening? Do you think they're the kind of people you want to reach? Because if you represent an ethical business seeking to connect with a global, environmentally conscious audience and align your brand with an effort to eliminate the gap between legitimate debate and public discourse, then reach out to me at steve@bionic-planet.com to learn about sponsorship opportunities. That's steve@bionic-planet.com. I'm also recognized as a 501c3 nonprofit through a partnership with Manga Bay, so larger charitable donations are tax deductible. Yeah, we talked about certainty and uncertainty, but I also find this issue of simplicity versus complexity really fascinating. All these variables, they make a lot of sense. Things like in-migration, migration flows, looking at specific drivers of deforestation, like mining. I mean, they get really particular in these early methodologies. And I thought the problem was that so many variables were put in that in the verification and validation phase, it became really difficult for VVBs, the verification and validation bodies, to really evaluate them. But you're saying the over-calibration also didn't surpass your own benchmark. So it's not just a function of implementation, it's a function of modeling itself. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how you whittled it down to these two variables.
Yeah, and so we've actually been, during the past 2 years with our group, we've been doing a tremendous amount of testing at a variety of places around the world. Not only have we looked at lots of other variables that people tend to use, we've also been looking at various statistical procedures to combine those variables. And these statistical procedures are some things that have been taught for decades in statistics classes like regression and other more newer machine learning algorithms. But as we dig into the mathematics of those, we realize all of those are based on this fundamental concept of relative frequency, which is, like I said, it's a middle school mathematical concept. And even some of these very modern machine learning algorithms, they're just a really fancy way to get at this relative frequency, which we already have, and it's much easier to understand. And as far as the selection of the variables, if you think of the two variables that we already have, one of those variables dictates where deforestation has occurred. That then already combines all sorts of things. Humans do not deforest randomly. It's a lot of effort. It takes a lot of work to cut or burn down trees. And they do it strategically. People have thought very carefully about where they deforest. And so if you just predict that they're going to continue to deforest near where they deforested before, you're probably going to get it right. Also, what we've learned is this variable of municipalities. It aggregates a lot of information. Humans make their development plans on municipalities. Humans even draw those municipalities to have equal numbers of people, so you have higher population densities in the smaller municipalities. So we take into consideration human population pressures, and where the cities are, they've not been distributed randomly. They've been very strategic. People in the early days, they figured out where the good soils are, and they started building around there. So if you just see where they deforested, you probably already have the information about where the good soils are. And people know where easy access is, via rivers. but then they've already deforested there, and those tend to be in different type of municipalities than the other municipalities. So, much of what humans do is dictated by even topography. Topography dictates where the rivers are. Rivers are where people first transport. Topography even dictates where people make roads. And nice thing about topography is it doesn't change very much over time.
Right.
So you can have a variable that's stable, and that's even associated with roads. I've been involved with so many modeling projects, and I've run into some people. I say, what's your definition of a good model? They said, a model that has more variables. And I'm like, really?
Yeah.
Where'd you learn that? And they said, on the part of the world I come from, that's what we all think. And I said, no, I'm striving to eliminate variables. Because what we found is adding lots more variables just really doesn't help that much. And it's tremendously expensive in computational time and even communicating this to people. And the more variables and the more complicated math, you just alienate people. There's two types of people out there. Some people get very impressed when they cannot understand it. And that's not a helpful way to think. But the critics will say, they can't understand it, but then they'll try to reproduce it, and they try to use a method that's too complicated, and even they get confused in their criticism. We've even had critics try to run the models and say that the models are no good, but some of the critics just don't know what they're doing. In part because some of the models they're trying to use are so complicated, it is challenging, but that's why we've designed this model to be so transparent, because this concept of relative frequency applies to all of these fancier ways to go about the mathematical prediction.
Yeah, the current methodologies are about aligning models with specific types of deforestation. And to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but the newer models won't really address things like mosaic deforestation, right? I mean, that's a sticky one.
Well, yeah, that can be challenging. Yeah. And there's a variety of types of deforestation. Carbon offset projects have various methodologies for each particular type. So what we've been working on is deforestation.
At the frontier.
Yes, at the frontier.
Which is the bulk of it,
Yeah. And so the mosaic can be really challenging for a variety of reasons. One of the challenges is how do you define mosaic? And even countries have enormous variation in how they define forest. In some countries, you can have less than 20% tree cover and it's still considered a forest. And then how do you even map that is a remote sensing challenge.
Yeah.
Some people just want to make the model more and more complex.
Yeah.
I think because that's what they enjoy doing. But as they do that, they alienate a big part of the research community because the mathematics is opaque. And they're not even necessarily addressing the most fundamental issues, like how do you define a forest? How do you measure the quality of the input data? And what type of modeling procedure do you use? We've gotten to the point that I'm now starting to trust the model more than I trust the input data. Because when we run the algorithm and the model appears to predict incorrectly, we realize that the model was doing exactly what it was designed to do, but the data on which we're testing it is wrong. And we can just do this by just looking at the data and then looking at Google Earth. And we see lots of patches that are classified as non-forest, but you look at Google Earth and they were forest. And because there's lots of challenges in remote sensing. There's cloud cover, you have to patch images together, and it's tremendously challenging to make a time series of maps where the difference between the time points portrays true change on the ground. But I say it's challenging. I don't say that the data are bad. I don't say that the data are good. But what I will say is that the research community, they don't even have a very clear answer of how accurate do the data need to be for these models. And so some people look at the data and say, oh, there's so much data problems, I'm not going to trust this. But actually, the data don't need to be accurate at the pixel level. I'll give you an example. If you have a map that's at the 30 meter by 30 meter pixel resolution for a country, and you want to estimate how much forest there is in that country, you can have a map that has substantial errors in it, but estimates the quantity perfectly. It might be misestimating the spatial allocation of the forest, and it might misallocate that by just a few pixels. But that's not relevant to the research question. If I'm concerned about a RED project, I want to be able to predict the deforestation within that region of the RED project. And if my model is wrong at the 30 meter pixel level, well, that's not important. What I need to know is the model sufficiently accurate within the quantity of deforestation within that RED region? And that takes a lot of work to think about. And so I think many scientists, they jump too quickly at saying that the models and data are not good enough. Because again, I'd ask them, if someone says the models and data are not good enough, I'm going to raise my hand again and say, could you please define good or good enough? And it's even challenging because at the end of the day, for these application of RED projects, we scientists have no clear guidance from the policy people of how accurate do we need to make our predictions. And so if they're not willing to say that, then I don't think anyone has a right to tell us that our models are insufficient and our data are insufficient.
I have to admit, I also fall into this sometimes as well, thinking we need better data, thinking we need more variables, and overcomplicating things. It seems to me like a human compulsion.
Yeah.
I remember when I was trying to learn carbon accounting and trying to understand bootstrapping, and that's where you take like a small sample size. If it's too small, you just keep randomly sampling your samples from your sample and running the model, and it works. It's I cannot intellectually understand how that works, but it does, and that makes me crazy.
I'm a full professor. I've been at Clark for 25 years now. Clark's ranked in the top 10 doctoral programs in the country for decades. I take advantage of that when I give talks, I talk about the things that I am confused about and how easily I can be confused. I was just meeting with a group of scientists the other day, and I posed a question that had 3 pixels. And I said, I don't know how to answer this question, and no one else did either. Okay, so I think it has to do with my training as a mathematician. Mathematicians are always trying to eliminate distractions, get to the essence of something, and make it as simple and transparent as possible. And so in my work, I'm always trying to eliminate things rather than add things, because I realize I can get confused even with simpler things. But then I pose those simple things to other people, and they say, oh yeah, they're confused also. I do have a social agenda, and the social agenda is to make people feel very comfortable by saying that they don't understand. Because if people can admit that openly, then people can start to talk about what they're most confused about, and that's how we learn. That's how, the dialogue can happen.
Yeah. That's it. Something just popped into mind, which was a presentation I saw about 20 years ago by a guy named Steve Ross. He contributed to the Cox-Ross-Rubinstein model, which is an option pricing model that's very widely used. Billions, trillions of dollars have probably been transacted based on his calculations. And I saw him at an event, and he got up, and all he talked about was uncertainty. He said, look, don't think you're all so smart, because these models come from fluid dynamics. We're not dealing with fluid dynamics. And he closed by saying that the average daily volatility is over 1%, and we have no explanation for that. So we need to keep concentrating on what works, try to make it better, and really just understand that we don't know everything. Or constantly be questioning, constantly be ready to adapt and change. Looking for something.
Yeah, I think he's on the right track to have a discussion about the uncertainty. But when we have that discussion, that doesn't mean that things are unpredictable.
Right, exactly, yeah.
But it means that, okay, so here's my philosophy. It's trivial to choose to look at something in such detail that it's impossible to predict accurately. Easy to do. It's also trivial to look at something in such a simplistic manner that it's trivial to predict accurately. And so my approach is to start with the coarse resolution that we think we can understand and that we can demonstrate that we can understand by predicting accurately to see if we can. And if we can, then start to add more detail. And when we add more detail, our predictive power will decline. And once we see the predictive power declining rapidly, then we're right at the learning horizon. And that's where our ignorance is, and that's where we have the potential to learn. But then the question is, at that level of detail, is it even important for our practical question? And so it could be, for the particular applied question, maybe the course data is already sufficient for the practical applied question. And in which case, it would be silly to try to get more variables and more data because we can already use what we have. But as far as predictive modeling for carbon offsets, are the data good enough? I'm not even sure if that's a relevant question because the RED projects are already happening. And we don't have options to have data that would only be available next decade. We have data that are available now. And the question is how to do the most enlightening job we can with the information that we have, and how can we be transparent of what we know and what we don't know. And if we're transparent about that, then people can have a conversation about it, and they can decide to make investments in the problems that are important. And that's how we improve. For critics to say, well, the data or model are not good enough, we shouldn't, have RED projects. First of all, I don't think they have a definition of what data and models would be sufficient. And if they say we need better data and better models before we do anything, all the trees are going to be gone. So the question is, what can we do now to slow deforestation? And even if these efforts that are done in the name of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, even if they do not make a substantial dent in the global carbon budget, maybe there's other good things that can happen of this. There's RED and there's RED plus, and the plus is important. The co-benefits of preventing deforestation. That's preservation of biodiversity. It can be poverty alleviation. It can be stabilization of soils so mudslides don't happen, so places like Porto Alegre don't get flooded. It can be very dangerous to just say the science is not good enough, we shouldn't do RED.
Yeah, no, that's another issue too, because there's a couple of discussions going on. First, we talked about it before, how the first generation of projects were based on the best available science. And when I visit a project that probably won't make the cut under the new methodology, or will at least have its baseline adjusted downward, you can see that so many of them are clearly having an impact. The Catskill Corridor and Chulu Hills projects are two of those that I visited last year, and I've been profiling them on the show, even though they will probably have their baselines reduced. Now, people, the thing that kind of gnaws at me is that people on the ground will tell you they were chopping trees for charcoaling, but the projects brought in beekeeping activities. They built schools and factories and ecotourism. They started funding college scholarships. They did all of these things because when the proponents asked people what it would take for them to stop chopping trees, they said, give us other ways of making a living,
Right.
give us a way to pay for college. So there's all these benefits that have been put in. Those are tangible. They're real. They've clearly had an impact on the forest. They acted on the best available science. And baselines are designed to be adjusted over time, so the proponents kind of knew this possibility was coming, but they're still being pilloried because the newer models say they overstated their deforestation risk, and it's clear those people are better off because of the projects. The forest is better because of the projects. And I guess where I'm going is the newer approaches that you're doing now they're the current best available science. They're probably going to be eclipsed down the road as well.
Oh, I hope so. If it's not, then we're not doing science. If we're doing the same thing we were doing 30 years ago, it means either 30 years ago we were so brilliant that we knew everything, or if we're doing the same thing we were doing 30 years ago, that means we haven't learned anything in 30 years.
Uh-huh.
And I hope we've learned something. So in 30 years from now, if we're doing it right, we will be doing something different based on what we learn as we go along. And just look at human civilizations. When they've learned, they've improved. But learning is not guaranteed. Just look around the world today. I mean, things can go backward if discussions are shut down and if people stop communicating openly with each other. Things can get worse. And so that's where what we're designing into our program is to maximize the open discussion. And when we do that, we're going to learn about the successes that are difficult to quantify. And we're going to learn about remarkable failures. But it's those failures that we need to know about so we can plug the holes. And, some critics say, oh, this red project, it drove the indigenous people off the land. But then there's other projects that give title to the land of indigenous people. So are carbon offsets inherently good or bad? I'd say not necessarily. It depends how they're implemented. It's just like, is capitalism or communism good or bad? It depends how it's implemented. Is religion good or bad? It depends how it's implemented. My colleague, Dr. Dixon, said, there have been bad actors in red projects, and it's a problem because they give then red a bad name. The critics latch on to that. But we have a method to identify those bad actors and do something about it. To say that red has bad actors, name one human institution that doesn't have bad actors. Government, police, churches, academia. We don't get rid of all those entire institutions because of some bad actors. What we do is we try to improve the institutions. And that's exactly what this clarity of the modeling is designed to do.
Yeah, that's another of my pet peeves, when people try to pillory an entire institution because of problems that are really reflected in the circumstances maybe that they're trying to address. Or, the example I always use, I'm here in Chicago, and you can find gang violence, you can find poverty, you can find lots of problems, but it doesn't mean we revoke the city's charter. Although when Obama was in office, his DC opponents were trying to paint all of our problems as being something that he created, which is silly. And that goes to the issue of identifying legitimate critiques, issues to address, and then addressing them, and contrasting that with people who are just trying to promote an ideological drive against something. You mentioned in your office, you said you have to pass a no red sign when you come in.
Yes. In the hallway of the geography department of the geography building, one of the graduate students put up a little postcard, no red projects, because
The red circle with the line across.
Yes,
right? Yeah.
with the line through it. They said no privatization of nature.
Yeah.
I'm like, have they studied the tragedy of the commons?
Yeah.
No. And that it's, I don't even, is privatization good or bad? It depends how it's implemented.
Yeah.
Many of these that they want particular people to have control over the land, like indigenous people. Well, in my mind, that's private property. It's private property of the indigenous people. I don't think privatization is the issue. I think some people are against even people making profit off of this.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, at the end of the day, I need a paycheck because I can't go to my mortgage company or my landlord and say, oh, thanks, you can bond with us over your political views. No, my mortgage company wants money. I need revenues. Okay. People need a motivation to do particular things, and money is a great motivator. And that's one of, I think, the great things about carbon offset projects is at least it gives motivation to the people who have the most money to fund projects in regions that have some of the economically most disadvantaged people. My left-wing colleagues who are probably putting up that poster, they'd all be in favor of having wealthy people from industrialized countries support impoverished people in the tropics. Well, that's exactly what the carbon offset projects are designed to do. Where else are you going to have that incentive for that transfer of funds? I don't have much patience for people who criticize from their comfortable chairs and say, you're not doing it right. It's not going to work. It's too challenging. It's not good enough. Okay, do you have any better proposals? And some of the proposals I hear are, well, you got to change the entire power dynamics of human nature.
Right.
And it's like, how many thousands of years have we been working on that project? Is that going to happen before all the forests are gone? I don't think so. Why don't we try to do something while the forests are still standing?
Yeah, I'm looking at the clock now, and I can already tell we're going to have you back on to flesh out some of these issues that you raised. I'm wondering if we can come to the present and your work at Vera.
Yeah.
But first, I just want to kind of maybe fill in a few gaps, things that are going to be in this next episode when I go back and look at the genesis of this stuff and the history. Just important to lay out here that a model is just one tool in a methodology. A methodology is kind of like a recipe for developing a project. They take stuff that exists, a model is kind of like a measuring cup. You have different ingredients, you mix them together. And the methodologies that Vera currently uses didn't just pop up out of no place. They go back to an IPCC report in the year 2000 on agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. That's AFALU. And it was Sandra Brown, who you mentioned earlier, a towering, pivotal figure in this whole sector, who I plan to tell people about in more detail later. But she was a lead author on a chapter looking at baselines for REDD projects. And what they pointed out quite clearly was that there were multiple approaches. There was modeling approaches. GeoMod was explicitly mentioned. That there are also scenario analyses and common sense, and they all worked well under different circumstances. If you see a bunch of tractors lined up and people with guns, you don't need a model to tell you what's about to happen. So again, I'll go into more detail on this in a later chapter, but the 6 years after that IPCC report, Winrock convened a lot of the same scientists, brought them back together to evaluate the predictive value of existing models, including GeoMod, and then to find ways of incorporating those into some sort of standardized methodology for deciding how they should best be applied, how they should be improved, how they should be updated over time, etc. And they did this through multiple iterative rounds of expert review and public consultation that I will, again, be covering in a later episode. And that's what they still do, and that's what you're involved in now. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about your experience coming into Vera and what you found as a scientist coming into this organization that's charged with developing not just models, but methodologies.
Yeah, well, the venue was, it had to do with one of the basic structures that Vera had and that this community had is that they have various phases where they are open to anyone who wants to give them feedback. And every year I teach a class in GIS and land change models. And my number one rule for my classes is that the students have to make a difference on someone outside of that classroom. And so I said, look, it's like right around December at the end of the semester, Vera is soliciting open feedback on their modeling procedures. So as a course project, why don't you make a report for them and even make a video of it and submit the report and the video? We made contact with them and they were willing to listen. And then Becky Dixon was a great inspiration for us to start working more deeply and meet regularly. And then Professor Eastman joined us and brought in Clark Labs. And that's where our collaboration really took off. And the satisfying thing about this is we're designing a model for this specific research question, which is really what's essential, because we needed a very practical applied question. And various modelers have various particular types of goals. But one thing that many of us want to do is to guide landscape management. And then the question is how best to do that. And in some cases, prediction, it's even a ridiculous concept because the goal is to give advice for people how to make decisions to influence the future. Prediction would be like we're trying to guess what they're going to decide. It's like, no, we want to inform them how to make wise decisions.
Yeah.
So if in that case, it's helpful to make scenarios to say, okay, if we make decisions this way, here's one possible future landscape. Or here's another possible story about the way the world could unfold. And there's people who do that and do a remarkable job of that. Jonathan Thompson, one of my wonderful colleagues at Harvard Forest, has a modeling project for future scenarios of land change in New England. And one thing about that, it's designed very explicitly to engage stakeholders in the decision-making process. And he's spent years designing these scenarios. And so he has a recent trend scenario, which extrapolates the recent trends into the future. And then he has these other scenarios based on a variety of storylines. And I thought, boy, he's really doing it right to inform landscape management and decision making. But then I went out to lunch with him and I said how much I admired his work. And I told him some of the frustrations in my work. And he said, Gil, they've made all these scenarios and now he goes to the meetings and shows he has all these scenarios and people, the stakeholders, they just want to look at the recent trend scenario.
Right, yeah.
So it's very tricky
to
do science that a variety of stakeholders will find helpful because humans are complicated and people have various agendas. Some people, they've already made up their mind and they're interested in only the information that's going to support their position. Other people want the science to help inform them, but they might not even be certain about what science can offer them. So it's interesting, but it can also be frustrating, which is why I like doing the math. At least I've published my first book. It's called Metrics That Make a Difference, How to Measure Change and Error. It's like, how to measure change and error? Haven't we figured that out yet in science? No. But the book is all about mathematics of measurements. And there's a lot of innovative methods in there, which I really like doing because at the end of the day, at least I can't be wrong unless I've got a typographical error. I know in the equations I have, the left side of the equation will always equal the right side of the equation, even if there's some political revolution or social turmoil. So at least that gives me some comfort in, at least given my personality, that I can say something definitive that's going to be true in future years. The equations will be true. Whether or not they will be helpful, that's debatable. But I want to do more than that. I want people to use those equations. I've designed those equations to inform things like land change models that will have an influence on how humans manage landscapes. But as soon as you get humans involved, it's all sorts of unexpected things can happen. Because humans are very good at, as soon as you lay down a rule, they will figure out how to conform to that rule and still get their objectives that they had all along. But I'm not saying that we shouldn't have rules, but we need to figure out how to make the policies effective. And the way we do that is implement them and see what happens and learn from that and move on from there. But for the critics who say these red projects shouldn't exist, look at what's happening in places where they don't exist. The forests are disappearing. So if someone has a better proposal that's plausible and doable, let me hear it. But until I hear that, I'm going to keep on working on these computer simulation modeling for red projects.
Going back to your interaction with Vera, you come in with an idea, you've been an academic, you want to get into where the rubber hits the road. What was it like to come in from this world where you've been creating the models and now you're dealing with the people who are going to be trying to turn them into parts of an actionable methodology?
Yeah. So it's been remarkable. The people I've interacted with at Vera, Salvador Colon, he's very experienced. He really wants to do the right thing. He wants it to be scientifically rigorous. He wants them to be effective. He wants to help people. And he is maximizing learning. He's not afraid to talk about controversial things. He'll communicate with his superiors at Vera about that. And he has such great integrity. It's always such a pleasure to work with him. And if the people at Vera didn't have those kind of personality characteristics, I would have bolted. I would not have stayed involved. But it's interesting to hear the kind of pressures they're under, because we all have to respond to our motivations and our incentives, and we all need a paycheck at the end of the day. And when we've made some modifications to the model, and that might influence these investments that have already been made. And so the people who have already put millions of dollars, they could have put it in a variety of places. But there are many people who want to do good things with their money. They've had these investments, and then the question is, well, how does the model influence their investments? And, something that wasn't on my mind when we were modifying the model. And maybe it shouldn't have been on my mind. But that's the type of feedback when you get people to work together. Because if the people funding this withdraw their money, then the people in the tropics aren't going to have access to those resources. But what was interesting that he said is that the investors were not vetoing the new model. They wanted clarity. And, that was so good to hear, because that's exactly how we designed the model, such that other people can understand it. And so they just want to understand what's going on. And so when you make it based on the criteria that we had of understandability and rigor and not allowing the mathematics to be too complicated, then that keeps the investors engaged. And the investors did not come in and say, we insist that this model be a particular way.
Right.
The investors were asking questions. They were not making requests concerning outcomes or even dictating the methodology. But what they wanted to be able to reproduce it. That's a reasonable
Valid, yeah.
request. And so what's necessary for that is clear documentation, testing. It needs to run on various platforms. And that's where we've benefited so much from Professor Eastman's decades of building TerrSet and having a customer base for TerrSet, because he realizes that in order to have a successful software, you need excellent documentation, you need customer service, you need an interface that people can understand and that's not prone to mistakes. And those are some of the biggest contributions that we've made in the model. We've taken care of a lot of those issues.
Yeah, this is a huge, sticky issue that I really think should be talked about more often, because they've been criticized for this, for listening to too many people. And this is one reason I'm doing this series on the history of this stuff, because a standard setting body has to find a sweet spot where most experts align and where you're like, okay, here's the predictive value, then here's what capital will allocate to. Because if you don't do something actionable, it's just an academic exercise. It's like the exercises The Guardian has fallen in love with and elevated above all of this, which I find kind of silly. You have to create something that's both predictive and actionable.
Right.
And it's universal. A mediocre baseball player ends up on a championship team. He's got a ring that better players don't get because they were on the wrong team. That happens. You don't take the ring away.
Right.
I remember writing up programs to reduce nutrient flows into rivers in the U.S., basically agricultural runoff. And this was like 20 years ago in the Ohio River Valley. They were trying to pay farmers for doing things that would reduce runoff. And they realized very early on that the first models were going to be wrong. It was just unavoidable. Maybe the farmers would get overcredited, maybe they get undercredited, but they agreed up front that they would have to honor that first generation, or we don't get a second, third, and fourth generation.
Oh, absolutely. I forget who the philosopher was that said, perfect is the enemy of
the good. Yeah.
And if we're going to not take any action until we think it's going to be perfect, we're not going to ever take action. And even if we do not take action until we think it's going to be perfect, we're going to be wrong, because it's never going to be perfect. And we've seen this with any sort of policy. So for people to say, oh, this won't work with red, it's not going to work perfectly, but we've had all sorts of other things. We've had soil conservation strategies, because we're dealing with things like the Dust Bowl. With a soil conservation strategy, if you pay farmers to not cultivate or put land into fallow, they figure out ways to work the system and squeeze out some money where they didn't really deserve it. But at the end of the day, are we better off for those policies or not? Mm-hmm. And if you're worried about corruption, there's bigger corruption in the world to worry about. There's corruption every place. So are we going to have these concerns about this, that the boat's not perfectly tight before we sail it? And we've got to try something. We're going to have successes and we're going to have failures. That's guaranteed. But we have to design a system that's such that people keep on trying.
Yeah.
Because if they try once and they said, oh, that didn't work, I'm never going to come back, well, then we've lost important players. So we need to keep people engaged and to keep on trying to improve.
Yeah, and doing it in an open, inclusive way. I think Vera's been accused of lacking transparency, but I'd argue that's not the case at all. I was covering this stuff for 20 years, and they were very transparent. I think what happened is the world stopped paying attention, and they began to communicate in ways that only resonated with people who'd done their homework. So when people who haven't done their homework come parachuting in and don't understand it, they try to say, well, I don't understand it, therefore there must be something wrong. And then you also had the phenomenon that you were talking about, where people who did understand it used this lack of broader awareness to distort what was really happening. And that, again, is something I'm going to be covering more in the future. But opening things up to public discourse can be a double-edged sword. Have you heard of the reptile problem?
Tell me.
It just showed up on LinkedIn. It was a guy from McKinsey, and I forget his name. He said that when he was a young consultant, he proposed some kind of a stakeholder analysis or questionnaire, and the older guys just laughed at him. And he's like, "Why not?" They're like, "Hey, it's the lizard or the reptile problem." And apparently, a few years earlier, they had done some similar surveys, and they decided to insert some control questions in. And one of them was, "Do you think lizard people run the planet?" It's only 8% said yes. And so they tried this a few times, and they concluded that 8% of respondents are just going to give you answers that are completely idiotic. So opening up too much without expert review is going to get you hijacked, because not all opinions are created equal.
It makes me think of a colleague I had at the Mazikowski Institute at Clark University, Jim Gomes, who had tremendous experience in the environment issues in Massachusetts, especially working with legislators. And Jim said after his experience, he realized that there's some people, they'd rather fight than win.
Yeah.
They want to have an argument. They want to appear that they're right and other people are wrong. They like the conflict. But think of the damage that can happen. Even within science, I see people making fundamental blunders, and I see other people that they're actually too polite. They don't tell someone that they think the person is just flat wrong. Mm-hmm. And then the person doesn't get it.
Yeah.
And so I try to express myself in a way that gives an opportunity for the person to grow and to engage. Mm-hmm. But then some scientists when I've engaged with, I realized, no, I should have used a harder approach. Because even within the last month, I've asked two scientists why they use the metric that they have. And they say, because it's popular. And I say, oh, so you're doing it because other people have done it. And they said, yeah, it's popular, therefore it must be valid. Because people want to be doing it if it weren't helpful. And I'm like, have you studied anything about human history? It is possible for large numbers of people to do really stupid things for long durations when they follow the mentality that I'm going to do things because other people are doing it. If a bad idea gets into that system, there's no way to get it out.
Yeah.
And so even to link back to my work on kappa. So first I published the paper about these variations of kappa, and that helped me get my tenure. And then after tenure, I published the apology, Death to Kappa. And now that's the Death to Kappa paper is my most highly cited paper, which I felt good about. Because that's how I'm evaluated in my profession, number of citations. Until ResearchGate starts sending me at 3:00 every morning, they send me one paper that has cited my paper. And typically it's a Death to Kappa paper. And I start reading how some people have cited it. Some people have cited, it's been proven that kappa is the most effective measurement of accuracy. And cited my paper entitled Death to Kappa. It's like, was I being too subtle in the title?
It doesn't sound that way, but yeah.
They didn't get the message of the title of the paper that they cited.
Yeah.
And I made that title because I knew people cited work that they never read.
Yeah.
But that's why I put it in the title. But not only did they ignore the paper, they stated emphatically the exact opposite of the paper. So I did a research with some of my students, Tom Francis and my co-author, Marco Milonas, who was on the Death to Kappa paper. We researched people who cited that paper. And what we've realized is half the people who cited that paper still used kappa. But then another half didn't. So in the scientific community, there's enormous variation, just as they're humans, just like in any field. People are in it just to make a publication, to keep their jobs, to do what everyone else is doing. And they will always be followers. But other people, they're trying to learn and they're trying to test out new things. and learn new ideas. And that's how things progress. You're not going to be guaranteed success by trying something new, but if what you've been doing in the past hasn't had the intended effect, if you keep on doing it, you shouldn't expect things to change. So, the same with the red projects. If we just say we're not going to be willing to try something new, then what's going to happen is what's happened in the past. And that's why there's red projects, because we look at the past and we don't want an extrapolation of recent trends. We want to change the tide somehow.
Gil Pontius of Clark University wrapping up this edition of Bionic Planet. Next week, I'll resume my series on the untold story of the voluntary carbon markets, but I hope you found this conversation as interesting as I did. Also, if you represent an ethical business seeking to connect with a global, environmentally conscious audience and to align your brand with my effort to cut through the ideological nonsense that's muddying public discourse on climate and biodiversity finance, then reach out to me at steve@bionic-planet.com. That's steve@bionic-planet.com to learn how you can become a sponsor of Bionic Planet. That's steve@bionic-planet.com. And if you're just looking to support the show in a charitable way, I'm also recognized as a 501c3 nonprofit through a partnership with Manga Bay, so larger donations are tax deductible. That wraps up today's show. Until next time, I'm Steve Zwick in Chicago. Thanks for listening.